Joining me now for his take on all of this is political editor for the Australian newspaper, Dennis Shanahan. Dennis, we go from important things to a bit of farce there at the end. Let's start with the important things. Clearly today was dominated by China. We had former Prime Minister Paul Keating out there publicly. We had the fallout coming after Friday's news that 2 parliamentarians would be denied entry or visas into China. The delegation set for December. Where are we at with this relationship?
Oh, look, I think that clearly the relationship is not good and that there are clear problems with China's actions. Now, the other thing we have to look at here is that overall, take a step back, overall the relationship with China is actually very sound, very solid and very important. We have a security dialogue with China. We have a free trade agreement with China. We have huge exchanges of people to people with China and Australia. We actually, apart from the disputed islands and the artificial islands in various parts of the South China Sea, have quite a good relationship militarily with China. We have had joint exercises with China. So we shouldn't get too carried away by the Communist Chinese government's attempts to flex its muscles in every way it can to advance its own ways and opinions and advantage. By the same token, we should do exactly the same. And I think that while there is no doubt the word from Beijing was that Andrew Hastie's words about China, his very straightforward criticism of the system of government in China, didn't make it any easier for Scott Morrison in dealing with the Chinese leadership. But we also have to make the point, and as Scott Morrison did correctly today, that when China responds in such a way as to try and ban MPs from entering China on the basis of what they have said, not what they've done or any crimes they've committed, but on what elected representatives in the Australian Parliament have said, it's outrageous and it requires that the government retaliate. And that also makes the point here that the government has been making this point quietly, as my colleagues Joe Kelly and Jeff Chambers revealed in The Australian today. Months ago, the Australian government quietly disassembled a mechanism, a joint mechanism between China and Australia that had been in operation for several years. But as Scott Morrison said today, it wasn't active. The Chinese had closed it down, so we formally shut it off. These are the things that you have to do in a serious relationship. And I also note that former ASIO boss and former ambassador to Washington, Dennis Richardson, made the point that we shouldn't, give way. We shouldn't give way to hysteria about China, nor should we give way to their confected alarms and claims over the artificial islands in the South China Sea. Right. This is telling it as it should be.
Yeah, well, just on that, Dennis Richardson was also the head of the Foreign Affairs Department, head of Defence in addition to his ASIO time. I want to play some comments that he made, and I'll also get to the issue of freedom of navigation exercises in that South China Sea, in and around those disputed man-made islands you just referenced, Dennis. Let's have a listen to what Dennis Richardson had to say.
We have a very different relationship with China today than what we did 10 years ago. We have different leadership in China. It is more assertive. It is therefore a relationship in which we have shared and conflicting interests. We also have our values which need to be properly reflected. It means we'll have negatives such as Andrew Hastie being denied entry, such as the suspension of the human rights dialogue.
Okay, you mentioned an apparatus, a technical cooperative apparatus. I think we put in about $7 million front page of the Australian. It has formally been shut down. I agree with you. The Chinese had rendered it inactive for some time. But the old human rights dialogue that Australia used to have with China, it went missing in about 2014. Yes, we have a free trade agreement, but we've seen when the Prime Minister has gone around the South Pacific in particular, Dennis, there's been some pushing and shoving, and I think a lot of bartering from some of our neighbours about, well, if you don't give us money, Australia, we'll get some funding from the Chinese, which has put Australia in a bit of a diplomatic and strategic bind. And Dennis Richardson says today, and I have to say I 100% agree with him, we should be conducting a freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. We shouldn't be bullied by China. We shouldn't hold back. Right now, the only ones who are doing that, well inside the bounds of international law, of course, are the Americans. That's another debate that's going to happen, I think.
All of this is right. The problem is it is a very complex situation. China is being extremely assertive, much more assertive than they have for quite some time. They still don't territorially, militarily assert that influence, apart from the islands and the territorial claims at sea. But they are using economic influence, diplomatic influence, financial influence, and the power of lending to extend their influence. It's a new China that we're dealing with. It's a new powerful China with a new range of weapons at its disposal. Now, I think that what Dennis Richardson is saying, particularly in relation to the South Pacific, is that we have to be realistic about it. There are times when we have to deal with China, and remember Dennis Richardson had some quite straightforward things about the leasing of the Port of Darwin, saying that it was perfectly okay. It was a straightforward commercial operation and wasn't a strategic threat. I think this is where we have to make the difference, where people have to be calm and make the point that China is not a direct strategic threat to Australia, and we have to behave like that. We have to be able to defend ourselves, and we have to be able to cooperate with our allies in the Indo-Pacific. And I say that particularly India, Japan and the US and Australia are four very formidable democratic powers in the Indo-Pacific. So we need to have all of these powers at once.
Yeah. I agree with you. We need to foster that Indian relationship better than we have. Yeah. But I have to say, part of the reason why we temper our language in relation to China is we all know that basically they are underwriting our economy. Australia isn't economically separate from China. We're institutionally separate, we're separate in terms of ideals, all of those things, but economically, you know, we're pretty compromised, and that makes it more difficult, particularly for the government. Not so for the spooks and the intelligent types, but does so for the Prime Minister. I want to move on to another issue. Of course, Angus Taylor, there'll be an Energy Minister's COAG. One of the issues the government has going into the next election, and let's recognise they're sort of 8 months down now. They only got 2.5 years to go. They come around too quickly at a federal level. But the government has talked a big... It's terrible. But the government's talked a very big game on energy. There's the likelihood, we've talked about this in Victoria, of brownouts, possibly blackouts over the summer. We know Liddell will close in New South Wales, and there is no reasonable solution, and that taxpayers have had to fix the interconnector between New South Wales and Queensland. What's Angus going to pull out of the hat here to try and resolve this issue?
Well, look, the government's problems with energy haven't gone away. They're only getting worse, and these are for two basic reasons. The first is, for some time now, the federal coalition governments have been saying they will lower energy prices. And while Tony Abbott was able to demonstrate that quite clearly by removing the carbon tax, it has been much more difficult to try and lower consumer prices by using federal powers. And the problem, the political problem for the government, the federal government, is that it has said it will do this, and yet it doesn't have the power to do so. It's always a mistake to say you will do something if you're not in a position to do it, and you have to rely on others. And in this case, it's the states and it's the generators. The second problem is that the government's big stick legislation, which they've now passed and have got through, is way upstream. It's not down when you're getting your bill through the letterbox saying, here's another bill that's even higher than the last one. What the wholesale price is being charged on the spot market is a long way from you getting, as a voter, a ratepayer and a consumer, that bill. And so that is going to continue until and if those cuts in wholesale prices start to come through to the consumer price, the government will be able to claim a victory. In the meantime, all Angus Taylor can try and do is cobble together agreements from the states, try and do whatever he can to avoid blackouts and brownouts and higher charges, while all the time it's the state governments making these decisions on supply, the shutting of coal-fired power stations, refusal to start new gas stations. I mean, these are all state government problems, and until Angus Taylor decides to really bite the bullet and say we are going to start to intervene and ensure there is new baseload power, then he's going to be swimming the wrong way up the river.
Yeah, well, the problem is it's on Angus Taylor's desk because Malcolm Turnbull put them there. Malcolm Turnbull made energy a federal government issue, and he was back today, a bit of a podcast with Christopher Pyne. I'm not going to give it a free advertisement because I would relegate it to the must never listen to, but I will tell people at home what they need to hear. Let's have a listen to a grab I'll play now of Malcolm Turnbull on the election.
I'm surprised that I got as much done as I did, given the difficult circumstances, political circumstances we faced.
Do you think we would have won the Prime Minister, the election, if he'd stayed as the Prime Minister?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's not many people
who doubt
that, actually.
No, I agree.
The reality, Christopher, is, and you understand this very well, I think most people do, is that during my time as Prime Minister, I was fighting always on two fronts, but that, you know, there's no point complaining about it. That was the circumstances.
That was the pitch you were given to play on.
Goodness me, Dennis, I'm not going to ask you whether you thought that he would win, because I don't think he says not many people doubt that he would have not won. Well, of course he wouldn't have won. There's no way he would have won. I won't insult your intelligence. What I found surprisingly was the line at the outset which said, I'm surprised I got as much done as I did. Well, be buggered, Dennis Shanahan, what did Malcolm Turnbull actually get done?
Well, he got same-sex marriage through, and I think that...
well, that was the Australian people, but anyway, yes.
Well, yes, but he was the Prime Minister, and he
what
got
else did he do, Dennis?
That.
Come on, what else did he do?
Where he began, though, where he began that little interview was saying, you know, not many people doubt that he... Well, for a start, a majority of his own party room thought that he wasn't going to win. That's why he was removed. So I think that he's having trouble with numbers and, as always, having a bit of delusion about his own abilities and being able to translate what is a highly intelligent person's personality into successful politics. He couldn't have won anyway.
All right, I'll put you out of your misery. Dennis Shanahan, as always, thanks for your insights on a Monday night.